All right, so I know that you've rocked near 150 some episodes of the Huddle with JT podcast. I too am over 100 episodes of this show. I have a question, and I realize I'm putting you on the spot, but if this were to be the best podcast that you and I were ever part of to date, then what do you think we would accomplish today that would make it the best episode we've done ever?
That's a great question, Justin. And, I think back to what I often share is this idea of like being all in. And that is something that I've taken from my coaching, from my time as an athlete. And it just all in for me reminds me to be right here and to be right now. So I think for us to have the most enriching, impactful conversation, we simply need to set the intention that we will both be right here and be right now, and beautiful things will happen.
I love it. Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now, I often share with people, is the most powerful book that I could recommend. Maybe yours will be one. You are a greatness as well, but in terms of those classic go-to resources that people are looking for when it comes to mindset, Power of Now is one of them. It's hard to do though, so I'm curious, what have you set up in your life that you think will allow us to be able to be fully present right now?
I often remind myself and others, right? So I have found that when you often communicate things to others, they are often reminders you yourself need to hear. So I think the one I would say is to be an active listener, right? I often remind people, we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So I would say what I'm going to set the intention for is to actively listen to what you're asking, share from the heart. And then it's going to be sort of that proverbial, like sort of tennis match, badminton match, where we just sort of play off each other and go back and forth. And again, have an honest, open, transparent conversation.
I appreciate it. I can remember back to first starting podcasting, and now I'm able to coach other people if they were to want to get started. Like I can support them with starting a show. But I remember when I was first doing interviews and not really knowing what the heck I was doing, but thinking I did, when I would go to edit episodes prior to ever having someone edit for me or anything like that, I would look at the wave files on each level, and it'd be so hard to tell who was talking when, because I would feel compelled to speak over someone or to finish a sentence or answer in there. And then oftentimes I found that guests were doing that too. And so it was hard to know like who's talking when. The wild thing, and it's been so cool to see recently, is I feel like as an interviewer, it's just as much up to me to make those wave files a little cleaner by asking clear questions, by, as you put it, that tennis match, that exchange being a little bit more clear cut. So I definitely love that. I think this will be a really valuable conversation to help people with. And one of the things that we talked about before coming online live here was the fact that we both are educators. And so that idea of communication is something that's taught a lot in, let's say, teachers college, or it doesn't matter where you are, any type of teaching. Before we get too far from the topic though, I'd love to know, when you say the idea of being an active listener, having effective communication, could you just break that down a little more for us in terms of what people could learn about their own listening or interviewing or conversational skills?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like you said, my time in education allowed me to, and maybe I'll sort of rewind, give some context of why I chose education as my first sort of professional part of my journey. For myself, education was challenging at times, like most people. I didn't really kind of knew where I fit in because, certain things that I was raised with, certain values from my parents and my family didn't always resonate with me. So, I really struggled at times. So my intention of going into education was just this idea of like, I just want to help others to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel appreciated, right? Which is ultimately at the end of the day, the greatest need of every human being. So I feel like when we talk about communication or active listening and per se, that's like the starting point of everything. When someone is communicating with you, we've sort of been programmed and conditioned to just want to give our opinion, to give our feedback without actually like listening to like, what is this person doing their best to communicate to me? And often if you come with sort of that open mind, and, you know, one thing I use with my coaching clients is I guess, oh, so it sounds like this. And very often then, you know, sort of being able to sort of mirror back to them what they're saying often allows people, again, to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel appreciated. But then you sort of guide them in a way where it allows them to discover the answers for themselves, as opposed to, again, you come from education, just that sort of person at the room, front of the room that's just pontificating, that just gives you the answers whenever you ask a question. So that would typically be is that idea of like just helping people, again, feel seen, feel heard, feel appreciated, and just showing them that you're actually listening and confirming, you know, what it is you're hearing.
Earlier today, I was being interviewed about the topic of growth mindset. And the idea that I was trying to get across was that we can all benefit from taking a learning stance no matter what we're doing. And the example you just shared is an incredible example of how you took a learning stance in your own life to decide on that pathway based on family values that you said, I think, weren't quite aligned with how you felt, or you wanted to pass on something different to others or explore that for yourself. Could you share a little more about what that misalignment was and the family values that led to you making that decision?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's always interesting, right? Because one of the biggest parts I've learned, you know, you talk about growth mindset. You know, I think it's really important that we understand like growth mindset, you know, from my understanding of this idea of like, let's celebrate your past, but then also understand you have the power to create your future. So in terms of celebrating my past and just sort of looking, as Steve Jobs said, you know, you can only connect the dots going backwards, you know, where I feel like some of the misalignment was, which is something that a lot of first generation, you know, again, my parents immigrated to this country in the mid 70s, came here. So, you know, they're immigrating halfway around the world, right? They're bringing these values, these cultural habits, right, from another part of the world, and then they're being immersed in a completely different culture. So again, things that were valued, and both my parents were born in Hong Kong, you know, were not always aligned with what Canadian culture was at the time. And then you add in the fact of, you know, there are certain beliefs, right, that, you know, we've heard this in education, right, that, you know, I think back to, you know, Asians stereotypically are great at math, you know, they're great at music, they're great at sciences. That wasn't my lived experience, which is okay. So I felt like, you know, here you are, you know, culture from one area of the world, culture in another area being smacked together. You're first generation, right? Things that people tell you that you should be good at don't come easy to you. The results aren't really telling it. You also add in the fact of Toronto, the GTA, very different than what it is now. I will say I did not look like many of the people I grew up with. So you add all those things together and you really start to question, like, it's easy to sort of, who am I? Right. So I think from there, it just sort of put me on this journey of just personal growth, self-discovery, you know, growth mindset, to just really exploring that question. And it's been filled with ebbs and flows, but, you know, every experience has made me a stronger, more powerful being.
No, thank you for, you know, being vulnerable and willing to share that. The fact that your identity and appearance, you know, didn't fit in some ways, and the stereotypical stuff, I think that'd be good to touch on. But I just wanted to dig a little deeper when it comes to, you mentioned the beliefs that your parents emigrated to Canada and brought with them. Are there single words or phrases that would give people an appreciation of what those beliefs were?
It's interesting because as you share that, when I first started this journey away from education, entrepreneurship, it was interesting where I could really go back to the areas that were misaligned. And that was part of, me sharing just now. But, I've also sort of learned this idea and had a great business coach to sort of help me understand this idea. So to give you context here, that pain and purpose are the same coin. They're just a different side of it. So certain values, right? Like this ambition, and I'll give you an example. My mother did her MBA and she was doing it part-time, working full-time. So very often I would spend many weekends as a young child in the back of a lecture hall at York University while she's getting her MBA at Schulich. And it was interesting how at first, yes, maybe the ambition was not there in the math and the sciences and the music, but I did develop that ambition. I did have that quality. It was just directed in other areas, right? Like sports when I found it, right? This thirst for knowledge, right? This love of communication and writing. So I was really starting to understand that, yeah, we have, to answer your question, certain limiting beliefs, but then you can also flip it and start to understand that some of those beliefs actually empower you in different areas of your life. Maybe just not the ones that, other people think they should be in.
Now, this is an impossible question, but putting those beliefs, the stereotypical things that you had to face, and the identity together would lead a lot of people to shutting down, to not excelling the way that you did. Now, on one hand, it's important to give yourself a pat on the back, but also I feel like it would bring value. Are you able to point to anything that you think that led towards your achieving or going the positive route as opposed to all the directions you could have went with those challenges?
It's interesting because as you share that, I think of these like different inflection points where you start to realize like, oh, like I get it there. And, I think of my journey, probably it wasn't until about grade 11 where it really hit the fan. Like you talk about from a results or did like severely underachieving in school. I would say now, knowing what I know now as an educator, former guidance counselor, like there was no clear post-secondary pathway. So it was interesting that from those, it was kind of, you get a taste of what you don't want in life. And you often need to go through that before you can sort of determine what you do want. So I remember kind of like the marks kind of hitting rock bottom. And it's like, okay, like something's got to change. And it was interesting that it was actually, it sort of forced me to sort of get benched in my grade 12 year, one game in high school football. Again, I know we talked about mutual connection. My high school coach, Coach Terry Lyons, who moved on to the University of Windsor. And, he kind of said to me, he kind of loved me tough. He talked about like sort of this idea of you are not reaching your full potential. You're not giving me your all. And it was almost like I needed to kind of go through that, that benching, the sort of the feelings of embarrassment that came with that for me to be like, okay, I need to put forth better effort and a better attitude. And from there, it sort of propelled me athletically. It then parlayed into me having a desire to play football at the post-secondary level, which then prompted me to kind of get my act together and develop the habits to go post-secondary. So I think it was that idea of turning some of that social, emotional, mental, physical pain and then actually using it as, sort of gasoline to light the proverbial fire in my belly.
When you chose football as one of those paths, because I can have a lot of empathy for what that was like, was your family really supportive of you when it comes to football?
You know what? Again, like many immigrant parents, my parents coming to this country, they came here with very little and they created a life for us. They put my brother and I, through school. They put a roof over our head. They put food on the table, kept the lights on. So I think my parents' focus was more about providing us a life, right? Like it was moving us forward. So they didn't have the freedom to just come and watch, games at, 1 and 3 o'clock. It actually wasn't until university where, something kind of piqued their interest where I still remember they saw an article and that sort of got them to realize that, okay, he has some gifts, some talents and abilities in this area. So, I think so it kind of sparked a little bit, maybe a deeper appreciation on their level, just because they both weren't very involved in athletics growing up. So, they came a little bit later, we'll say.
Yeah, it's a cool part of the story though, and I had seen that with many teammates over the years whose parents weren't like my. Interestingly enough, parents were very much in football families. My uncle played football at the Big House in Michigan, won a Big Ten championship. My dad didn't play football, but he was like a huge football fan growing up, both the CFL and the NFL. So it was not something that I ever had to think about until I was in locker rooms with people whose family, for example, were like 7-day Adventists. They weren't even supposed to be on a football field. And it took a long time for their parents similarly to come around to being supporters of them and helping people figure out their pathways in life and make decisions. It's something that I had never really thought of in terms of those constraints some people might feel around making decisions like, hey, I like football, so I'm going to do it, but not realizing that maybe some familial things could be getting in the way as well. And that goes into all of these different pathways. And so one of them for you and I, just to inform the listeners, was traditional education, so to speak, was going to teachers college, becoming a teacher. And so people might be listening to this and they may be thinking, hey, I want to be a teacher when I grow up. I mean, a lot of people talk like that. I hear my daughter say it. A few people I look up to have pivoted from the career. Humble the Poet is probably the most famous one, fellow Toronto educator, and now yourself. And I was doing some research for the show, of course, and realizing that I feel like both in university as well as our careers, I'm just about a few years, maybe 3 years behind you or something like that. So this really hits home on a personal level, but I know it'll help anyone thinking about that career. What was it that led you to decide that it wasn't for you?
It's been an interesting journey, right? It's often, and I appreciate the question, Justin, because, that's the power of a great question. Like you're asking it prompts us to stop and think, to reflect on the journey, right? And then by sharing again with, an honest, open, transparent heart, it's through that lived experience that you can share a nugget of wisdom that can help someone along that journey. So I just want to thank you for that question. Yeah, there have been different marks. I think back to this idea where, it's 2015. I'm a department head in health and physical education. I'm on all these like leadership tracks. My wife and I have this beautiful home, 2 young kids. We travel and, you have this new house and you have all the, it's like you've checked all the boxes of what society says is successful. But I felt like something was missing. Like just something just felt, like off, and then fast forward, I make the decision to go against the grain who, people are saying like, I transferred to a new school and people are like, are you crazy? Why are you giving up a headship? I'm like, I don't know. I just feel like there's something calling me that's more, or fast forward 2019 and decide to leave teaching. Again, something just felt like I was called to impact and serve more people than just, my 3 classes and, the kids I coach in football and track. So really the theme has really been this idea of hitting moments where I am experiencing a lot of pain, again, physically, socially, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, like to the point where there are often in parts of the journey where I'm laying on the floor crying with my wife at night, just wondering like, what is up? Like, I don't get it. I've played the game and there's still something missing. And from those moments, I've realized, again, I needed to go through that. I needed to experience what I don't want to get me clear on what I do want. And from that, what I've really taken is that ability to take courageous action, even if it's a small, putting one action that's going to move me closer to what I want. And from there, it's been this beautiful journey of just discovering more about myself, what brings me joy, what brings me, peace, and just continuing to move in that direction. Right. So that's really what has sort of inspired a lot of pain, but through that pain has allowed me to discover things about myself that I didn't know or had to rediscover, remember.
And those things that you didn't know is something that I'd love to try and figure out a little bit more of. But I'll mention something quickly, that this is one of the moments in all of the episodes that I've done that's the most difficult for me to craft a line of questioning, because it's the most personally connected that I've ever been to a topic on this show. I've talked about grief, and with people who have lost, actually the episode that's airing today, she lost her brother and I lost my brother, and we talked about that topic. But it was slightly removed from the moment, right? And for right now, because I've made such similar decisions about stepping down from a leadership track in education, of moving schools to a school that's a lot more aligned with the things that I want to do, and also thinking of, hey, can I pursue this podcast full time because it feels more aligned? It's so hard to not get distracted right now. I know I'll pull it off, but it's a lot of like thinking and reflecting, as you put it, that's going on right now. All that to say, when you share that you were crying on the floor and asking your wife what it was that was missing and trying to figure all that out, you mentioned that you often have to go through things to know what you don't want, and then you have to go towards things that you do want. Are you able to like put bullet points on those two sides of that list? Like, what was it that you didn't want, and what was it that you wanted more of?
I appreciate the question. And the first thing that comes up to mind is this idea of freedom. And I'll dissect this. It wasn't until I left education where I realized how much of my life was governed by other people's bells and whistles. Like, it was like, show up at this time every day. You have lunch at this time every day. You go home at this time every day. And, for someone that is naturally curious, such as yourself, that's creative, that's stifling. So then it allowed me to understand, before we hopped on here, I realized how much joy I get by just having the ability to choose, what I spend my days doing and who I get to spend that with. Like, I find the most enriching days are when I get to spend days doing what I love, right? Whether it's, coaching my clients, whether it's writing more, whether it's having enriching conversations on podcasts, whether it's helping create an immersive Football Ontario event that aligns, universities, high schools, community. Those are the things, speaking, those are the things that really fill me up, that bring me a ton of joy. So it's that. So with that freedom comes sort of this idea of like, when life feels too rigid, and it's that idea of like non-negotiables, habits. I can do that. Like, again, I think probably you being a high quality athlete, we'll do the work. It's not a question of putting in the work, but is it like, are we doing it with our full energy, full enthusiasm? That's been the biggest change for me. And the really cool part is, it has brought me a different level of love, joy, and peace in my life. Like anyone, I have my moments, but I do find that, again, when you spend your days doing what you love, with people you love, it just, life just feels different. It feels more freeing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And again, I've got like 1 foot in, 1 foot out, because what I've done so far to solve that exact problem is I've managed to find myself in a school teaching photography one-on-one from 9 a.m. to 12:30. That's my school day, and creating outside of that. And a recent guest, the episode hasn't aired yet, but Cody Warner, who's a really successful, I guess people like to say full-time YouTuber, but we were talking about the topic of ADHD and how much he struggled with his mind throughout like conventional work and how he's like the worst employee ever. But it's really tough to find what works for us. In your case, it sounds like the majority of it is coaching. I know you podcast and you speak. In his case, it was YouTube. And for people who are struggling with that idea, though, of pivoting to entrepreneurship, let's say they're scared. I know that the word side hustle is often used. Like if somebody comes to you with that problem and you know you only have a few minutes to really help them out, let's say at a bus stop or something, and you're like, "What's up, man?" And they're like, "I'm really struggling. Like I'm a teacher. I want to go pursue entrepreneurship. I want to build a business." Like, what are some of the overarching tips that you give someone struggling with that?
Yeah, great question. And it's interesting because I thought of a conversation I recently had with a coaching client who's in the health and wellness space. And she was just asking me about this idea where we all at times struggle with our calm and confidence, right? And they often talk about personal growth, self-development, like imposter syndrome, right? And I remember thinking and this idea of, if you are sharing from your lived experience, how can you ever feel like an imposter? So I'll give you an actionable one. My first experience, diving into the entrepreneur world was doing a workshop just that shared how my wife and I paid off our mortgage, which was just under $300,000 in 44 months. And the interesting thing was, if we're talking facts here, like I lost money on the event, but again, what I've come to realize, it wasn't about, making money. Like, yes, ideally in entrepreneurship, yes, you do, to create a sustainable, lasting business, you do have to generate income. But I realized that what I really needed to gain from that was just having the calm and confidence to pivot away from teaching, sharing something I had already done with my wife, and just sharing some of these practices, right? And the really cool thing is, I reached out to over 50 people, 5 came. But the really cool part was those 5 people had a great experience. And one was a former teaching colleague, and she really took from it. She ran with it, and she started to achieve the freedom she wanted. So it's really cool that, again, we all have our different journeys. But again, I was able to help and serve her along her journey, just sharing what I had done in my own life. So yeah, we just, I guess maybe this is a way to say it. Your best position to serve the person you once were. So find a problem that you solved in your life and then share it with others, right? Something good's going to happen from that.
Yeah, that's huge. And I think we're getting towards something that can really be valuable to people listening and trying to figure out, how the heck do I pay the bills? And that becomes the classic question that's almost annoying for creators like you and I trying to support people, because the short answer, we all know, is find a market, find an audience, solve a problem for them, package it in a way that makes sense with your values, slap a price tag on it, and sell it. But you referenced Steve Jobs earlier and connecting the dots backwards. I think that advice can be so overwhelming to people that they almost don't do it as well. And I've gotten a lot of feedback that the more actual examples, like you shared about your first workshop, of how people succeeded in being able to make money as an entrepreneur, sharing some of those dots that have connected really helps people. So was it workshops that you were able to figure out? You mentioned coaching already. What were some things that you were able to do to actually pay the bills? And I guess another fair question is, did you have to do that a little bit on the side before you ever went all in?
So that workshop that I referenced was late January of 2019. So I left teaching. I put my resignation papers in July of 2019 on the blessing of my wife. I would have thrown it in much earlier, my resignation papers, but again, I said it on the day we got married: happy wife, happy life. So I was not going to go against that. I literally burned the boats with no plan B. Like it was my wife and I are not in agreement in terms of the entrepreneurial life yet, but we can agree that we do want to travel with our kids more. So we did find some common ground there. It wasn't actually, and then once I left teaching, had the space. I mean, you're an educator, the school year, your time and energy is in demand, right? It's not a career where you have a lot of free time if you're doing it at a high level. But that space then allowed me to dabble in like different 30-day challenges, allowed me to create a community for men, which again, also just dabbling, right? It's just growth. And then it wasn't until June of 2020 when we got back from Southeast Asia. And if anyone remembers 2020 June, again, the world was on pause. So it was then where on that trip, I sort of decided, no, I want to do, deeper life coaching, executive coaching. And that's where I made that decision to go all in. What I would preface people is I would, as much as that was my journey, like I was in that much pain, I was willing to, as Napoleon said, like burn the boats and not have a plan B. I'm also learned that that's not everyone's journey. And you have to have the peace of mind that it's okay if you're just getting the boat closer to the dock through these creative projects, right? Try different things, see what aligns with you, right? So, just continue to move in the direction of growth, get the boat closer to the dock. And when you feel like you'll never feel completely ready, but when the boat's close enough, go all in, jump right in.
And what about in your experience succeeding with that coaching business? Because I'm sure there probably be people listening be like, so I did all those things too, and then it didn't work. Were you investing in courses, other coaching yourself, a bit of both, just researching like crazy, trying a whole bunch of things and seeing what stuck? Like, how did you go from the bureaucratic sort of background to full-fledged entrepreneur and not fail?
I will say it's still a game that I'm playing every day, right? Like just, it's interesting. I would maybe just sort of remind others that, let's call a spade a spade. On social media, we see everyone's highlights. You often don't see all the reps and sets that are being put behind closed doors, early mornings. You're not seeing some of the trials and tribulations, and that's okay, right? So for me, the journey started in 2016. I picked up a book. It actually happened to be Pete Carroll's Win Every Day. I think it was. It was a football book, but it was more about football. It was about personal growth, self-development. My wife said, "Hey, just listen to this podcast, Lewis Howes. He's a former pro athlete. Like, listen to him." So my wife's pretty intuitive. So I started, really diving into the podcast, diving into the books, consuming like hours and hours and hours of content. Probably a third of my day was just boom, listening. I'm going out for a run, listening, going to the gym, listening, driving a car, listening. And it wasn't until probably about 2019 where I started going to workshops, started going to different networking events, and started really investing more time, energy, money into myself. Fast forward, it was about November of 2019 when my wife and I first left. She had reconnected with a great life coach, executive coach, and we got it for her. And the interesting thing was we got it for her because she needed it. It wasn't, again, I listen to podcasts, I go to workshops, I read books, like I don't need a coach. And it was interesting that as I went into the work with her, right, and started studying it myself, it's almost intuitively she knew I wanted it. So then fast forward, the type of coaching that her coach did, that kind of immersed me into the world of coaching that I do, which is there's lots of different life coaches, executive coaches, but the type of coaching I do is based on, natural universal laws, integrating spirit, mind, body, very holistic approach. So yeah, it's been an ongoing journey the last, 7.5 years.
I just love hearing the journey. A lot of times on podcasts, it's really important to get into the practical how-to, and I create bullet point blog posts, but I can put myself in the shoes or the headphones of listeners these days, and appreciate the follow-up questions that they would have, that if we wrap the episode, they hang up being like, man, I wish I knew blank. And then of course they could DM you or ask underneath a post or whatever. But those are the types of questions I like to just continue to push down further, And one of those as well is the idea between teaching in a classroom versus the one-to-one style coaching you do now. What do you find is a difference that you appreciate?
Well, one, at the very least, I am better. I have more tools in my tool belt now because I have invested more time, energy, and money into getting to know my greatest resource, which is myself. I actually have a better understanding of myself. And because I have a better understanding of myself, I can then have a better understanding of you, right? So that's the one. What I've come to appreciate about the one-on-one is you can just go deeper with someone. Like I've done large group coaching, and that's great. The challenge is it does feel like a bit of that classroom where, you can reach more people, and that's kind of interesting in the world of coaching and scalability and business. But it's taken me some time to actually realize, like, I love these one-on-one conversations because through those one-on-one conversations, I can get laser focused on you. And by getting laser focused in you, I can actually find out what it is you want. More importantly, where it is you want to go. And then by asking some questions and actually actively listening, I can then sort of listen for what could be holding you back. I can then offer you a different perspective. And then when you start to discover it, you have the choice whether you're going to continue forward. So that's what I really love about the one-on-one is like that when the light bulb goes on, right? And I also love when you hit, you touch someone's heart. And I'm not talking about like the physical heart, but like their deep, emotional heart, right? Like what the early Greeks referred to as the emotional mind. And you help them to unlock something that's holding them back. Like, and the tears come and it's like, you've just given a gift. Like you've just removed a perceived limit, a limiting belief from someone. And now they can choose to live more free. Like, so that's what I love about one-on-one. And that's, so I feel like I'm still doing the same things, maybe just at a different stage of life.
Yeah, I love it. You and I are like, I was about to say spirit animals, maybe like spirit brothers or cousins or something, because I did a lot of coaching as my first career, then went into teaching. And since I've coached, but very infrequently, very much through like word of mouth referral and under very unique circumstances, only because I'm measuring my own time, right? Not that I wouldn't go into it again in my future, but like you said, as a traditional educator, we're pretty busy. And for me, it's taken a while and being coached to get to the point where I realize how important this podcast is as my one thing. And so that needs to show up in the daybook and in the schedules as where my energy is flowing right now. So I don't have as much time for it, but I do, like, it almost gives me chills thinking of back to some of the moments of success and touching people in their emotional heart. Now, you mentioned earlier that every coin has two sides. What do you miss about the traditional teaching, though?
I love working with young people. And as you ask that question, I'm thinking, what is it about education that I miss? And one of the things I love about working with young people is because they are chronologically younger, those paradigms, those limiting beliefs, right? That conditioning isn't as strong. So you can actually help people unlearn them a lot quicker, right? And part of it is probably why I was inspired to, jump into this opportunity with Football Ontario. It was very aligned, and, you still get to do some of the coaching and educating, which you love. Again, different stage of life. But what I found really spoke to me in this role compared to traditional education was, the young people, the high quality athletes, coaches and leaders I get to work with now. Like, this is their vehicle. Like, this is their jam. Like, they love it. They're emotionally invested. They want to be great in this area. So I found that being able to find that through Football Ontario allowed me to rediscover how much I love that, just working with people that just want to be great, want to be the best versions of themselves.
We've talked a lot about football without talking about football. If we run this through the transcript, I think it's been said 11 times already. It's a great through line. And I feel like, I don't know what the stats are, but not many people play it. And we're talking American tackle football for those listening. Whatever it is, let's say 99% of the population has never played football. Yet in that 1%, so many of us speak to the things that we've learned from it that are transferable. And so if we were to add a section of the summary for this episode that says, JT's lessons that he learned from football, because people don't know what the heck we're talking about, what are some of those things that you learned from that great game?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question, and I think of what's really on my heart now. One of the beauties of American football is we're in a time where it talks about EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Like, what does that look like in 2023? And again, as someone who's played at a high level, you know that there is so much built-in diversity within our beautiful game, right? Like on one end, you have linemen that could be 350 pounds. And then you have fast defensive backs like you that are like 170 pounds, right? You have people from all socioeconomic backgrounds. You have all people of different skin colors. It's a late specialization sport. So you could have come in, you could be the greatest hockey player, basketball player, volleyball player. You could come in and start it late, so that's what I love about that is that diversity piece. And this is where like my heart truly sings right now is, what can we do to make this game more diverse? And it's interesting that those lessons were formed, many years ago as a high school, going out as a high school student athlete, as a grade 9 to where I am now. It's just, I'm starting to realize more and more that it's just a vehicle to teach these greater life lessons. And for anyone listening, I would just remind everyone that we live in a world that is programmed and conditioned just to feed us more of people that look like us, that talk like us, that dress like us, that make the same amount of money, that have our same likes and interests. But there's beauty in being open to diversity of thought. And it's okay to disagree. I know, which is very different in today's quote unquote cancel culture. So I would say that football is a beautiful vehicle to teach power about the diversity of thought, right? Just being open to new and different ideas.
It is special for sure. I remember during my master's having a debate with a professor. We were reading the short story about unpacking the invisible knapsack, I believe it's called, about racism and prejudice embedded in schools. And it's very, very interesting looking back. And this has come up in my episode with Cara Ricketts. And she really put me on blast in a positive way, saying the reason why you were struggling with seeing racism was because you have had the privilege of not having to face that yourself. And I said to her, yes, but, and this is something that I can't explain to her or anyone else, growing up on a football team, when at times in like an athletic group, like being a DB, I'm the only white one. It's a really interesting thing that really never crossed my mind. I never had a thought of being prejudiced myself. Like it just, that was my friends. That's who I knew. So then it was hard for me to connect to these conversations in institutions like a university, where now I find myself in a room and there's like 25 of us who are white talking in circles about how to make schools less racist and things like that. And I'm trying to explain how I was having to unlearn that the world's not really like that. And it was such an interesting thing, and it's, I guess, similar to what we talked about earlier with entrepreneurship or coaching. It's an infinite game, and it's something that we'll all be working towards forever. But I bring that up to say I hear you when you talk about the diversity piece, because I think that's why I was so in tune with other cultures. And you're on a football field like 40 hours a week. So it's not like you're spending 2 minutes a day with these people. It's like they're your brothers. So I do think that that's a really healthy piece of the sport for sure.
I'm curious, you're describing that. And, I think back to my last year of teaching. I was sitting in I think that school board called a culture for learning. I was in this group where, again, I was sort of stretching beyond, phys ed. I had moved into more student success, culture for learning, all these non-traditional roles. And I remember sitting there and we're talking in a room. And I remember looking around and going, I don't see a lot of people that look like me. If I look at the circle of privilege, the only difference is I identify as a person of color. And I start to just looking around and I'm like, this is interesting. And remember not thinking much of it. And it wasn't until I sat in the OUA, Ontario University Athletics, put on a diversity in sport conference this past June. And I went as a representative of Football Ontario, where it's like we had all these powerful speakers and really promoting these inspiring ideas, like really facilitating some discussion. Like, hey, what's happened up to this point is great, but we can do better. And it just opened my eyes. So I guess why I share that with you is I'm just curious, like when you were sitting there, did it sort of challenge you to kind of think differently?
I think so. Yes, definitely is the short answer. What to do about it is where I struggle. But on another episode, it had come up the idea of two white people having a conversation is one of the most important and valuable conversations we can have as it relates to being anti-racist. And Parker Palmer, the name was escaping me. I had Bob Proctor in my head because I know that that's someone who you and I both look up to. So Parker Palmer spent his entire career as an author and doing work in human rights and activism on the topic of anti-racism. And he was on an episode of JKL previously, and I asked him about this exact topic because earlier that day, similar to probably the workshop you found yourself in, I was asked to speak on the topic of equity and inclusion in schools. And I didn't feel like I, in any way, was the right public speaker to talk to a bunch of other white educators about how to be less racist in schools and how to make a more diverse culture within a school. And I guess the short answer should be at a football program. But he was someone who really, really helped me in explaining how that was a question that he had to go his entire career tackling, but how he really early on learned that it is the most important conversation that we have. And as soon as we start thinking like we shouldn't be the right person to talk about it, that's an exact example of that privilege kind of rearing its head.
And it's interesting, right? Like as you share that, because it just reminds me that, we each, through our own, lived experience, our own upbringing, we've been gifted with a unique perspective, right? And as long as we share again from that perspective, and again, I go back to this honest, open, transparent, right, and willing to have hot conversations. As I have a great friend and great coach that I'm around that we talk, like we gotta be willing to have hot conversations. I find like that's the only way we learn and grow together and make this world a better place.
It is so difficult, though. I also heard someone else say the other day, every podcast episode you create, you're one episode closer to getting canceled.
Yeah, it's and it's interesting you share that. Had a coaching client reach out to me that I previously worked with, also a former teaching colleague, and they were asking me, like, would you be open to coming in and speaking on through, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And, I just said, okay, so I'm going to tell you, I know of a lot of great speakers. If it's just about like from a historical perspective, what the research says, I can connect you with lots of great people that way. But if you want someone to come in that maybe talks about EDI through like leadership perspective, like leading from the inside out, like embodying certain qualities, then that could be maybe a different way to approach a conversation. And why I share that with you is it was interesting because this great friend shared that they actually felt uncomfortable having this conversation with me. So I really took a moment to celebrate them for like leaning into that discomfort and having the courage to have an uncomfortable conversation. But it made me realize that this is someone who has shared, like we've gone to the depths of, their edges of, their deepest and darkest, their skeletons. And still to that did not initially feel comfortable. So it just made me sort of reflect on how many people are just living in that fear. Like they just don't know what to say. They don't know how to approach the conversation. And how many of them are just like, for better lack of term, just like suffering in silence because they're kind of like a top that's just spinning in circles and they don't even know where to begin.
And equity, inclusion, diversity aside, I feel like a lot of people are struggling like that too. I'll get questions from people a lot of times, or, hey, can you go for a quick walk or grab a coffee? I want to ask you something. And then they'll ask me a question that I feel is very simple in the sense that like it shouldn't be stressful. And it's often around, wanting to get into content creation, or like, I want to learn how to paint, but I don't know where to start, or I want to start a podcast and I don't know how to get started. And these are things that, because I've developed a growth mindset, maybe come natural to me where to start, but they had to work up so much courage just to ask me for a little bit of advice. And so I do think that a lot of people really go around with a lot of fear, maybe shame and guilt and things within their initial foundation, as you put it, holistic, but the kind of maybe negative side of that they're struggling with. That is a perfect segue into talking about your book, You Are Greatness. And the subtitle, if I'm getting it right, is 13 Ideas to Effortlessly Bring Joy, Calm, and Peace. For those who are still going to order the book after they hear this, but they haven't yet, what are some of those 13 ideas that can help people?
Great question. And I appreciate you sharing the book. Writing that book, one of the cool things about it was I didn't write it as a traditional, first chapter to the 13th. Like I truly wrote it as a choose your own adventure. Sort of you can pick it up, allow intuition to kind of guide you. Again, I'm a very spiritual person. So I do believe that, life's all divine time. Things come into your life and people come into your life at exactly when they're supposed to. So I shared different stories. So I have some stories in there, again, from my lived experience that are told through a lens of myself as a young person, right? As a kid, right? I think of that first story I share about, what lessons I learned watching my mom bring me to York on Saturdays and Sundays and seeing her go put her MBA. And that's one story. I share a story around this idea of belief around my last season of coaching high school football, about how we really started to instill a deeper sense of belief with our student athletes, our coaches, our support staff, our families, right? And then, I also fast forward where I tell a story about, do the illogical of what it was like, leaving the safe and comfortable world of teaching and sort of having no plan B and literally taking a proverbial leap of faith, right? So what I found through that is that by me writing through different lenses, different stories will resonate with different people. And it's really interesting what resonates. So typically when I meet people, I'll ask them, oh yeah, like what resonated with you? And it's interesting how some will share that it's something about the coaching aspect. Some will be at a sort of a life sort of pivot standpoint. They're maybe thinking of making a career transition. So they do the illogical will work, or if someone that's maybe been wanting to go all in on a new venture and they're thinking the ambition one is like, yeah. So I find there's different stories in there. And the cool part is the stories, You can read it less, 5-10 minutes, and there's a few questions just to sort of, encourage people to do some thinking and reflection. Get those thoughts out of here onto paper.
Hopefully you haven't come across too many people that tell you how good the book is, and when you ask them, they didn't actually read it.
It's interesting, even dealing with some of our young people that I'm blessed to work with through, my Football Ontario work, Team Ontario. I've even had some young men that have said, oh, I really like the quote, and again, hey, I put a quote at the start, and, if that quote is helping them, focus on where they want to go, great. I had a former student athlete who's playing at Western now, and he said, hey, coach, I love the book. I actually started to read. So, again, it goes back to that idea, like people are going to get from it what they need at that time. And, again, if I can share some of my lived experience and it cause them to think and dream a little bigger, I feel like it's, I've done my part.
That's awesome. It's very timely because on Twitter today, someone, he seems pretty reputable and credible too. And I think he'll probably come on the podcast to talk about self-publishing, but I gather that he's kind of like a hybrid publisher because he helps people basically self-publish, right? Get everything from the book jacket taken care of and all that. I've had Hugh's views on, he published like 20 books, but it was very much like how-to manual back 5 years ago when Amazon like ebooks was a really hot thing. So he was like pumping those out. That was his first segue into being an entrepreneur. And then I've had Scribe Media last summer get me on one of their sales calls to try and tell me that I really need to publish the Just Keep Learning book, and that if I pay them $20K that they'll make sure it happens in an effective way. So this is a fun thing for me. I plan on publishing, God willing, many, many books in my adult life. Let's say 18 of them will be very how-to specific, kind of like how to start a podcast or these kinds of things that I can add my personal input, but they're not like my life's work. And then 1 or 2 are going to be very heartfelt. They're going to take a long time to write. They will take a long time to read, but they'll be more in that traditional book kind of realm. I'm curious about the process because it's a very hot topic right now to be a writer. Money Twitter goes crazy for it. Everyone's like, writing's making a comeback. And the idea of writing and publishing, in part, I'll add, is being made popularized by people like Nicholas Cole, who wrote the book, The Art and Business of Online Writing. And it's really becoming successful because, as something ebbs, we flow back. And so with all the video and all the things, writing's becoming popular again. All this to say, what was your experience in writing the book? And if someone was thinking about writing a book, what would you share with them?
I published a book, when was that, 2021. And it actually went back to like when I was 7, where I actually loved creating and writing back in grade 2. And I remember we used to have these book fairs where you had an opportunity to do it in English class, creative writing. And if your book was chosen and selected as one of the best, it was put in the library and all that stuff. So why I share that with you is, did in grade 2, did not get the external recognition. Grade 3, same thing, did not get the external recognition. So it was, for whatever reason, I just stopped writing. Fast forward, I started to develop a deeper passion for sport. So again, these creative gifts sort of start to manifest in, the world of sport. And it wasn't until I left teaching where I really thought, yeah, there's a book in me. And I sat with it, I would sit down to write, just proverbial writer's block. And one day, 2021, I'm just thinking, I'm going to write a book. And again, I'm naturally pretty impulsive when I allow myself to be. Like I'm someone who, like, I have a bias towards action. I'll kind of figure it out after how to sort of put everything together. So I go for a long run. All of a sudden, I'm like, what's the title of the book? You Are Greatness. Okay. How many chapters is it? Okay, 13. Why 13? Because it's taboo and everyone says 13's unlucky. So then I start thinking about, okay, what's the title? Okay, it's all around this idea of calm and confidence, right? Like everyone talks about being calm and confident. But really what has helped me move forward is really understanding around self-image, like I am affirmations. So I started to map it out, right? And came up with these 13, get home, start writing down these ideas. Fast forward, I challenge myself. I'm going to wake up every morning at the start. I'm going to prioritize 1 hour to write. Within 2 weeks, I want to have the 13. I'm going to skeleton the book done. Finished it in less than a week. Put it out to my network. Hey, I'm looking up, publish, share this input. Yeah, self-publish. Oh, you need to meet my good friend, Eric, who turned out to be my publisher, right? And he has a company. It's kind of the hybrid model. Eric told me what his mission was. I was like, absolutely. Like I kind of looked into him a little bit, saw what he did, just loved the energy, loved the vibe about it. And we met, and he just helped me take the idea and turn it into physical form, and sort of got the book out there, and really at the end of the day, help to grab attention for the book. Because you could write the best book, but if people don't know about it, or it's sitting, you know, in the ethers and no one really knows about it, it's limited in what it can accomplish. So that was sort of the inspiration of the book and how it sort of came to be.
That's awesome. I think that's pretty thorough. I was going to ask, how long did it take you to write it? Yeah. The skeleton was a week. How long did you have to continue working on it?
Yeah, so I tweaked it a little bit. My wife looked it over. She has more of the discernment, so she kind of proofed it a little bit. And then Eric and I met, and then Eric walked me through and guided me through every step of the process, right? Like, this is the time we want to do it. I think from when we first met to when the e-published got version of the physical, I think we're a matter within like 90 days. So he walked me through it. Why I loved what he was doing was his mission was to help more healers heal the world, which I'm like, okay, yeah, that's very aligned. And again, he just helped me sort of focus on, okay, this is when we're going to release it here. This is why. And he probably sort of spoke to my teaching brain. He helped me to understand why we're doing things in a certain way.
Maybe Eric's got to hit me up on Twitter today. I don't know, but I'll check and I'll double back with you. Yeah, it's, like I said, a pretty hot topic right now, because I feel like for a long time, this makes sense with traditional publishing, people felt that they had to grow a large audience first so they could go get that, then get a publishing deal, right? Here's your 100K advance, and now we'll create the book. And there's still a big hangover from that. But from most of the people that I appreciate in terms of role models, mentors, and heroes, they say, if you have a book, create it. The other piece of tension for me is I see a lot of people creating books just as business cards, right? Like, hey, I want to go speak on the topic of podcasting, so I'm going to write a book on how to podcast. And I'm going to hope that then people are going to ask me about podcasting. But in reality, I just want to get a speaking fee, or I have this course on how to podcast and I want to have like a business card out there, and the book actually sucks. So as someone who appreciates a good read and hates when I pick up one that's not that, it's something that I wanted to make sure that I could at least have enough quality. I'll continue on my thread here of quality is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. Like, the person reading it is the one that's going to get to decide anyways. So now I'm finding myself in the middle where I'm like, I can create a book. I can create many books, and they can be good enough that they're not just sitting in my mind or on my laptop. I can actually publish them. They'll bring value, but they're beyond that sort of like scammy snake oil version of like, here, ChatGPT wrote this for me, and here's my book in 6 hours. Like, so I'm in a middle ground now. It's a fun spot to be. I guess naturally we'll have to kind of wrap, but a couple final thoughts. I guess if anyone were to go to write a book, is there anything else that you would advise them?
Yeah, I think it's just get clear on why you're doing it. And as you share that, I think back to, some of my journey. Has writing a book allowed me to gain some coaching clients? Yes. Has it allowed me to create some speaking opportunities? Yes. Right? Has it allowed me to, bring some unique podcast episodes? Yes. Yes. But the intention always was I just wanted to write something that I wish I had when I was along my journey, and I think back to, funny enough, my daughter, right? She carries a copy of my book in her bag to elementary school. And when she's there, like, she actually reads it. And I opened her book one day because there's journaling prompts and there's space to write. And she was actually using those questions to write and reflect on her life. Right. And it got me to realize, like, how cool is that she gets to see part of Dad's journey where he's been through and he's still here, but she just gets to see a deeper side. And if it prompts her to reflect, like, to me, it was worth the time and the energy, right? And the money to write that book. So yeah, just be clear on why you're writing it, right? And I guess what I'm getting at is I wrote it for me. It was something that I wish I had. Write a book you would love to read.
That's really special. Almost brings a tear to my eye just thinking about that. And I had never thought of that purpose and byproduct or side note. That's really neat. I could definitely picture my daughter doing the same thing. So maybe you just pushed me even faster to create my book. The idea of her looking up to you as a mentor or a hero makes me think of how we all learn from others. And I think it's so important to give flowers while we can in today's day and age, because we never know when it'll be too late. You've referenced Steve Jobs. You referenced Lewis Howes. We talked a bit about Bob Proctor. I mentioned Parker Palmer. In this creator entrepreneurial journey, if you were to tell other people about podcasts or other books that we haven't talked about, is there anything else that stands out?
One book that I found through, studying Bob's work is this idea, and this is one, again, psycho-cybernetics. As you can see here, it's been taped many times, so you can kind of see I've read it a few times. And why that book resonates with me, it's all around self-image, right? And what I love about that is, in this world of personal growth, self-development, it's all this idea, you got to integrate this habit, you got to meditate more, you got to eat better, you got to go to a meditation, you got to go silent retreat, you got to run more, you got to do all the journaling. At the end of the day, what it really comes back to creating real and lasting change in your life, you need to change the internal image you hold of yourself. And I know that's a big idea, but again, once you start to change that internal image you hold of yourself, that is what inspires you to take focused action in your life. And that's going to be the catalyst to creating change. And it works in any area of your life: health, relationships, business, finances, career, every area of your life. So Psycho-Cybernetics by Maxwell Maltz, great book.
Boom. Mic drop moment as we head into the theme questions. And I know that we can run it back in the future if doing another episode ever brings value to you, because we could talk on hours or days about these topics. So we could pick a whole other one too, and just be able to bring a lot of value to the listener, I think. So we can definitely do that in the future. In terms of heading into the theme questions, the first one is something that you yourself are learning right now. It could be off topic from all of this or very much on topic, but something you yourself are learning.
For people that, your listeners that tune in every week, people that read the books, people that listen to podcasts, people that go to workshops, people that invest in coaches, we naturally have that ambition, that drive, right? That open-mindedness, that coachability, right? What I'm noticing more and more is what actually really helps me to live with more love and joy and peace in my heart. It's just cooling the jets. It's just in the morning where, my wife and kids have gone to school and I'm sitting there reading a great book. I got a great coffee and I'm reading, and I just take a few breaths, and I'm just I just close my eyes and I'm just listening to, just the beautiful sounds of nature. And what it does is it, you asked me at the start of this, it reminds me that the beauty of this life is being right here and being right now. And I found for me, that's something I'm constantly challenging myself to, because I can quickly get, very future focused on, crushing it and new goals. So I always challenge myself to, again, let's cool the jets. Let's focus on the next play. Be right here. Be right now. So that's something I'm constantly learning, and I'll probably be learning it till the day I physically leave this earth.
Another great infinite game. We should go camping sometime.
Yeah.
If you were to give one piece of advice for the next generation, you mentioned Lewis Howes. So his classic question, you are only able to leave one piece of advice for that next generation. What would it be?
I actually just shared this because I had an opportunity to recently speak with a high school senior level business class. Had a young sport professional reach out to me, same question, like, what advice? And I just shared something a great coach shared with me. You work for satisfaction. You provide service to earn a living. And why that resonates with me is that idea, like, when you can be of service to others and truly help them with where they want to go, you'll always be richly rewarded.
Right. Solve a problem. And the better we solve it, the better it'll be. And the last one is just that if I were to give you the mic, I know you have a podcast. I think we'll do an episode on your show, but let's say you have the opportunity to practice for that show. What's a question you would ask me?
If you could go back, Justin, and you could go back to the 10-year-old version of yourself, and he was going through a time where, he just felt like the challenges, the obstacles, the adversity were really, he was up against it. What words of wisdom would you share with him?
It's really interesting adding an age specifically to it, because the constraints, I think in a positive way, make it very specific, right? And at that time, my parents were going through a separation, and if I were narrating a first person movie of my life, I would have to say at that time, things are about to get crazy and really difficult. Because had you asked me 13, I was in like the thick of craziness, and my advice would be totally different. But in fairness, it was at 10. And I think that the advice would be to be aware that at any moment, what we know as our life can change. It can change quickly. It'll feel like it's changing in a very negative way, but that there will be silver linings at some point. And as tough as it can be to be patient and looking for those, you will find them. Something along those lines.
So it sounds like, again, it would be that idea, like, everything's going to be okay.
That was actually the first thing that came to mind. And I was trying to break it down a little bit, because that's hard to believe when you're 11, 12, 13, going through it. The sun will come up tomorrow. It's like, yeah, I get it. But for me, this is just too much to handle right now. I feel like I could continue to break it down too. I had a psychologist years later when I was like 15, maybe 16, who you'll find this hilarious, and I'm sure you'll appreciate it. His number one advice to my parents, and he joked about it being a prescription, was to spend as much time as I could on the football field, because that was the main space where I felt safe somehow with people trying to kill me. And I didn't have any of the panics that I had with my like anxiety disorder. They didn't happen on the football field. Conversation for another day. In rapping, I always like to ask why, Because I think that's a valuable question, and where people can find your work online.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. I am fairly active on Instagram. So the handle's at so the word THE, J, T as in Tom, T as in Tom, S as in Sam, U as in unicorn, I as in ice cream. Fairly active there. I'm also active on LinkedIn as well. So for more in the professional space, but yeah, so that's probably where I'm the most active, and just, sharing parts of my journey, sharing some of the nuggets of wisdom I've gotten from my lived experience with the intention of just, helping people along their journey.
It's awesome. Well, one's a teammate, always a teammate in football. And I feel the same way when it comes to everyone I've had the pleasure of creating content with through this podcast. So I know we'll always be in touch. So thank you for doing this today.
All good, brother. Appreciate the opportunity.
Boom.